Good afternoon. I'm Amy Mascaratolo. I'm the Assistant Director for Alumni and Donor Events in the Smith Office of Alumni and Donor Relations. Thank you all for joining us, either live this afternoon or through the recording. Your participation helps to keep our Smith community strong, and we are especially grateful to Tomi-Ann for sharing her time and expertise on this relevant topic, especially in this unique moment in time. Give you a few housekeeping notes. I'll do an introduction, and then I will turn it over to Tomi-Ann. And I apologize, my dogs are sitting right here next to me, seeing things out the window. So if you haven't had a chance, please do let us know in the chat box where you're joining from this afternoon. All participants are muted to help limit background noise. This webinar will be 60 minutes long, and we'll allow approximately 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit questions through the Q&A box as well. I invite you to click your view option drop down and select side-by-side mode, and also select fit to window instead of full screen. We find those selections provide the best user experience. We're recording the webinar, and it will soon be made available on the Smith College YouTube channel. So without further ado, Dr. Tomi-Ann Roberts, class of 1985, is professor and chair of psychology of the psychology department at Colorado College. She's a social and personality psychologist and co-founder of objectification theory. Her work centers around the emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and health consequences of the sexual objectification and sexualization of girls and women.
Mouthfuls.
Absolutely. As a feminist psychological scientist, Tomi-Ann also believes strongly in moving beyond scholarly research to evidence-based advocacy in the service of a more equitable society. So I'm delighted to turn over our time together to Dr. Tomi-Ann Roberts.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen and pull up my PowerPoint, and we will play from start. I'm hoping that everyone can see this. So the title of my talk is Objects in Mirror Are Closer Than They Appear, and I'm hoping by the time I get to the end of the 40 minutes where I intend to do the talking that we'll understand why I've put that little pun in there. I am a proud Smithy, class of 1985. Shout out to any 85ers who are in this webinar. All right, now we got to get... Okay, I want to start by just explaining how much the personal is political. And I remember learning that slogan in the early 80s at Smith College. I was taking a women's studies class, and I learned the idea that the personal is political. When I was in the summer between my junior and senior year at Smith, I was still pursuing my interests in the theater, and in that vein, I moved to New York for the summer with a whole bunch of friends from both Amherst and Smith. And I waited tables and I did a bunch of auditions. And I happened to meet these two young guys, brothers, Bob and Harvey Weinstein, at the restaurant where I was working. And the rest of the story is something that we've all probably heard by now. I was pursued by Harvey to audition for the first movie that their company Miramax was going to be producing and directing here in the United States. Up until that time, they had been importing foreign movies. And, boy, that was exciting for me. I had quite a summer. I received updates to the script from time to time at my workplace. And I was invited by Harvey to what I thought was going to be a party, of course, at his apartment for a lot of the other people involved in this movie that was going to be made. And when I arrived, it was not a party. I heard Harvey call me from down the hall to discover him in the bathtub. And that was, a pretty arresting experience, as you might imagine, for a 20-year-old. I didn't do what I thought I would do in a circumstance like that, which is to say, screw you, and scream. Instead, I was very afraid of poking the bear, and I kind of politely and apologetically, I'm ashamed to admit, backed my way out of that situation. He tried to convince me that I needed to be comfortable with nakedness, that I needed to take my own top off because there might be a toplessness scene in the movie. But I got out of there, and I sort of threw my acting aspirations in the wastebasket, called a friend, got picked up. There were no cell phones at the time, of course. I had to find a payphone. And when I went to the audition, which I did anyway, Harvey, of course, wasn't there. And the casting director said to me very kindly, "You know, you're not getting this part, right?" So that was my experience with the casting couch. I returned to Smith. I majored in psychology. I graduated, and I went on to graduate school. And 30 years later, I saw an article in the New York Times, and it was about some movie stars who were confessing a very similar experience with Harvey Weinstein. It almost always involved a bathtub or a shower. It involved sort of pleading and coercion. And so I wrote a letter to Jodi Kantor, an email to Jodi Kantor. I said, "This is going to sound crazy. I'm not an actress. I'm a college professor of psychology, but something very similar happened to me." And it wasn't until I started getting asked a lot of questions, because that email ended up exploding. And as you can see here, I was covered in a lot of media about my experience. And the questions that were asked of me were very much about the sort of prurient interest. Everybody wanted to know exactly what happened. They wanted to know the details. But I decided to take the opportunity with all these interviews to move past the details, to say, no, I'm not going to talk about the details of my experience. What I want to talk about is what that experience prompted in me, and how on some level, that experience sort of launched a whole career on my part of studying the sexualization and the sexual objectification of girls and women, the treatment of girls and women as nothing more than their physical bodies. And that's kind of what brings me here to you all today. Martha Nussbaum, great philosopher, argued that there are 7 characteristics of objecthood. I was treated like an object by Harvey Weinstein, and not all of these conditions were met, but I just want to sort of talk through these conditions because they've been very influential in the work that I do. We can treat someone like an object when we treat them as though they are an instrument. Instrumentality is a characteristic of objecthood. When we treat someone like a tool or a means to an end. Karl Marx wrote about the treatment of workers as tools, right? According to Marxist ideology, workers are objectified, right? We can sexually instrumentalize someone when we treat them as a means to an end. They are just a tool for our own sexual or power gratification. The denial of autonomy happens when we say that an individual lacks self-determination. They don't get a say. They don't get a say. Inertness. This is an interesting characteristic. We see it a lot in print media advertising. Inertness is sort of treating an individual as though they're lacking in vitality, as though they're a mannequin, as though I can manipulate their physical body as though it's made out of clay, right? They're otherwise inert. Fungibility, interesting word. Fungibility argues that we can objectify when we treat individuals as though they're interchangeable with one another. One of these sorts of individuals is just like another. We can swap them out. Violability means that we objectify by treating an individual as though her boundaries are not intact, as though she lacks boundary integrity. She may be broken into. Ownership is the idea that we can buy or sell objectified individuals, right? Human trafficking is the most egregious example, of course, of the ownership characteristic of objectification. And finally, the denial of subjectivity. We deny objectified individuals their feelings. Their feelings do not matter. In fact, we often think that they don't feel quite as much as we do. They don't feel pain in the same way as non-objectified individuals do. My colleague Barb Fredrickson and I published Objectification Theory in 1997. And this was a theory that we proposed where we sort of took philosophical ideas like Simone de Beauvoir's, and we translated that idea into a series of sort of testable proposals for psychological science. We argued that sexual objectification primarily targets girls and women, and that it occurs along a continuum. On one end of that continuum, of course, is abject degradation. It is rape, it is trafficking, it might even be sexually motivated murder. On the seemingly more benign end of that continuum are things like catcalls and whistles and calling attention to female sexualized body parts as the things that matter about them. And we argued that this is one continuum. It's characterized, of course, the entire continuum is characterized by the reduction of the female body to its physical appearance, by treating girls and women as bodies or body parts, separated out from their personhood, commodified for others' consumption, or regarded as capable of representing them. In my work with the American Psychological Association Task Force on the Sexualization of Girls, which I was named to after publishing this earlier work, the APA will name task forces when it thinks that there may be a significant mental health concern. And we argued in our report that objectification and sexualization occur on 3 levels. Of course, there's the structural and cultural level. So look all around us and we will see in media and marketing depictions of highly sexualized feminine bodies, right? These bodies are used to sell anything from shoes to tires. Interpersonally, we can be treated in a sexually objectifying way. And I would argue that Harvey Weinstein's treatment of me, fascinatingly, right? Because he was very passive. This is a complicated issue, isn't it? Here was a naked man in a bathtub. And yet, he was able to weaponize his nakedness to interpersonally treat me as an object. And finally, intrapersonal. This is the most interesting to me as a psychologist. What we find is that girls and women will often introject or internalize into their own self-concept this sexualized way of being. They will begin to see themselves as objects and do things as though they are objects. Whoops, gotta go back. Ah, goodness. Okay, here are some terribly disturbing, of course, and I apologize, but I do want to just clarify how easy it is to find these kinds of images. It doesn't take me long at all when I do talks like this to update my images with current advertising that illustrates these characteristics that Martha Nussbaum shared. You see in the upper left-hand corner the fungibility feature, right? Here are some beautiful, clearly Asian sexually objectified women, and they're fungible. We could trade one out for the other. Wouldn't make much difference, would it? In the lower left, we see ownership, denial of subjectivity, and that inertness characteristic that I argued about. Also in the lower right-hand corner, we see inertness when women's body or body parts are literally separated out from who they are and used as table legs, for example. Here are just some examples of the interpersonal treatment idea: catcalling on the street, sexual harassment at work. My colleagues and I have been doing almost 20 years of research on the consequences of objectifying cultural depictions or treatment. So what happens? What happens when we culturally depict girls and women in this way, when we treat girls and women in this way? And what we see is a revealing of what we call unconscious bias. Human beings have unconscious bias against sexualized and sexually objectified treatments of females. And I'll explain this. So in the lower left-hand corner, I see an illustration of fungibility. In these studies, what we show is that, for example, in cognitive psychology, we know that objects and humans are processed differently. Objects tend to be processed cognitively in a piecemeal fashion. So if I show you an image of a house, you are processing pieces of a house. You're saying, does it have a window? Does it have a door? Does it have a roof? If it does, it's a house. And that piecemeal processing allows us to recognize an upside down house just as readily as we recognize a straight up house, okay? Human beings, in contrast, tend to be cognitively processed in a more holistic fashion. So we see the whole human being. And for that reason, when we depict a human being upside down, if I see an upside down photograph of my dear friend, it's a little bit harder for me to recognize that that's my dear friend. It takes me a little bit longer. Well, as you can see in the graph in the lower left, when we present targets, when we present human beings as sexualized, it turns out that that inversion effect stays present when the target is a male individual, but we lose the inverted image effect with sexualized female targets. What that illustrates, of course, is that sexualized women are processed cognitively just the same way as objects like houses are. And so upside down is just as easy for me to recognize as right side up, because there are the tits and ats, for example, to be crude. Research on young girls is revealing that we have a similar sort of a dehumanizing way of cognitively processing and making judgments about sexualized very young girls as we do about sexualized adult women. And the study that you see on the right was a study where images of girls from a children's clothing catalog in Australia were used. And adult participants imagined one of these two girls, either in regular clothing or in more revealing clothing. And they imagined that this girl was a victim of a bullying scenario. And then they were asked questions about this. And what we see here in this graph is terribly chilling, which is to say that the girl who's depicted in the bikini swimsuit is seen as somewhat more responsible for her own victimization. And we find that attitudes toward helping the girl in the bikini swimsuit, if she was the one who was the victim, are poorer. We're less likely to want to help that girl. My own research with my students right now, we're looking at very highly sexualized images of and videos of dancers that are wildly popular on YouTube. Some of these videos that we look at have upwards of 1 billion hits and likes. And what we find with an eye tracking study is that our adult participants, when they are watching highly sexualized dance, they find that they make judgments about the lead dancer that are very similar to the previous study, which is to say that they believe that the lead dancer who is dancing in a more sexualized way is less human, more dehumanized, less ability to feel uniquely human emotions like shame, and having fewer uniquely human traits like competence and understanding. So I want to thank right now, I just want to pause for a moment and thank the Me Too movement, which I like to consider myself a part of. I began calling myself a sort of academic voice in the Me Too movement. And I want to thank Tarana Burke for founding our movement and for shining a light on the consequences of this sexually objectifying treatment, right? And sexually objectifying environments for women's capacity to thrive in the workplace. This is what we're talking about today, right? So I'm pausing to sort of say, when we're looking at the structural and interpersonal level, I think we're learning how difficult it is to thrive in the workplace when we are subjected to sexually objectifying treatment. And now I want to take I want to dive down deeper, because what I want to talk about is what we can have a conversation about regarding, does self-objectification, does the internalization of this perspective also carry negative consequences for women's capacity to thrive in the workplace? And I hope to convince you, yes, that it does. In our paper back in 1997, we argued that objectification leads to self-objectification. This is where we borrowed from Simone de Beauvoir's wonderful book, The Second Sex. And we argued, as Simone de Beauvoir did, but we argued in a way that would allow psychological scientists to test our predictions, that girls and women will internalize a second sex status. They will become preoccupied with their appearance, just like Freud said that they are. Freud said, oh, girls and women, they're constantly looking in mirrors, how vain they are, right? We reinterpreted that vanity as strategic. And in our paper, we argued, it's the case that women's physical appearance plays a huge role in the outcomes of their lives. So of course they will become preoccupied with their appearance. Girls know that their sexy selfies are gonna get a lot of likes, and girls want a lot of likes. So to begin to do the work of self-objectification is to become someone who wants to gain status in the gender hierarchy the way it exists right now. But we argued that this self-objectification, this preoccupation with how you look on the outside, carries consequences. It carries economic consequences, mental, and even physical health costs. Recently, I've published a couple of papers with some big teams of colleagues where we were able to make the link between objectifying treatment and increases in self-objectification. So we wanted, most of the research in social psychology happens in labs. We did two very, what we call ecologically valid studies where we fitted individual women with smartphone apps, and we had them keep track of sexually objectifying treatment that they experienced or that they witnessed in their real life around them. And we found that more than 65% of women were targets of sexually objectifying treatment in a 1 week period, right? 65% of women in 1 week experienced sexually objectifying treatment. And we found that when they were subjected to this kind of treatment, it led to increases in this preoccupation with their physical appearance. It led them to self-objectify. We found in other studies that sexually objectifying treatment leads to increases in vigilance and in personal safety anxiety. Women who are treated this way begin to be very vigilant, not only about their own appearance, but also about where they go, what they do, what they say. And most fascinatingly for me, we found that just like breathing in secondhand smoke, even witnessing others being objectified led women to self-objectify more and led to more of those downstream consequences. So many of the women with our smartphone app witnessed others being sexually objectified. And that witnessing creates what we call, right, a hostile environment. And it leads me, myself, when I witness that treatment of another woman, it leads me to begin to become more preoccupied with my safety and my appearance. So here's some examples of all the ways that we intrapersonally objectify, right? We participate willingly, right? In a culture that says that our bodies are a project, we have to maintain the project, we have to display our bodies in ways that are going to gain us approval, that are going to get us a partner, that are going to get us the things we want in our life. Ray Langton, another philosopher, said something I've never been able to get out of my head. One way to make someone an object is to make her make herself an object. And some years ago, back before COVID, I had the great good fortune of going to the new Whitney Museum, and I saw this fantastic exhibit on protest. And there was a whole section in the protest exhibit on the Guerrilla Girls, who I remember vividly in the 80s, plastering posters up everywhere. Self-objectification, my colleagues and I argue, is both a matter of seeing and a matter of doing. Once I see myself as someone for whom it is better to look good than to feel good, once I'm aware of these idealized standards of sexy, thin, youthful appearance, and then I accept that standard, that triggers and sets in motion a whole bunch of doings, right? So I begin to habitually body monitor. I invest in fashion, sometimes cosmetics, even surgery. I restrain my eating. I check and I adjust. I may change the way I talk. I may curate my selfies, and on and on. You can think of other doings, I'm sure. In 2002, I wrote the following, that self-objectification operates as a kind of internalized control. It's a sort of colonizing of our minds. It's ensuring self-imposed powerlessness. In a sexually objectifying culture, self-objectification leads to this vigilance, and it's keeping us in a constant state of preoccupation. And what are we not enjoying? What are we not doing when we're constantly preoccupied with our own physical appearance and our own personal safety? What I'm going to argue is that that ultimately undermines our capacity for self-fulfillment and self-determination. So here we are. What are some of the consequences of self-objectification for the workplace? I'm going to go through these kind of fast because I want us to have time to talk about them in the Q&A. Many studies, this is just an example of one, many studies have been done now showing that if we can induce a state of self-objectification in participants, then we see that their cognitive capacities are diminished. In this study, what we did was we had individuals, college students, male and female, participate in what they thought was a consumer decision-making study. And at first they smelled different fragrances and rated them. Then they went alone into a makeshift dressing room, alone. I'm going to repeat that several times. And they were asked to randomly assigned either try on a swimsuit or a sweater. Then they spend some time in the dressing room getting used to the garment, we say. And while they're spending time getting used to the garment, they help us with a study that the math department is doing. And we have them in their garment complete a math test. Yes, they're all alone in the dressing room, remember? And there's a mirror. And what we found is then they come out, they get in their regular clothes, they taste test some things. Among the things we found was something really quite stunning, which is to say that women, no matter their body mass index, no matter their actual size, felt far more self-conscious emotions like shame and even disgust when they're standing in a swimsuit in a makeshift dressing room. Men feel self-conscious, but it's mostly pretty lighthearted. They feel a little bit embarrassed. They feel like it's funny that they're standing in a swimsuit. But the most stunning finding was that disruption of cognitive function that the swimsuit caused. So for females in a swimsuit, they performed far more poorly, significantly more poorly on the math test, correcting for their actual math ability, than females wearing the sweater. For men, we saw a slight improvement. In fact, men did better on the math test when they were sitting in the swimsuit than when they were in the sweater. What we argue here is that seeing yourself in a swimsuit, even if you're all alone in the dressing room, reminds you of, it puts you in a state of self-objectification. Oh my God, my body, it does not meet cultural standards. And that preoccupation is so occupying that you have fewer cognitive resources to devote to the things you love, like maybe your math. We find in our studies that self-objectification leads to women getting smaller and getting quieter. We had, in these studies, we have individuals participate in what we call sort of an ergonomic study, and we surreptitiously have them either in a very upright position or a kind of slumped over position. Charles Darwin would predict that individuals who are upright feel very powerful. In fact, we've heard of power posing, right? What we've shown is that for women, power posing is not that straightforward. If women are wearing a very tight-fitting tank top, for example, when they're in the upright position, they do more poorly on cognitive tasks and they feel less proud, right? Why? Perhaps because in a form-fitting tank top, the breasts are front and center. And so what we're arguing here is that self-objectification undermines the capacity for a straight up posture to give me a feeling of power. Why? Because I'm reminded of the way my body is looked at and treated in society. Is self-objectification and self-sexualizing empowering? Well, not so much. Many of my young students say that they love to self-sexualize. They feel very powerful when they do it. Pole dancing at home alone may make you feel powerful, but studies show time and time again that self-sexualizing women in the workplace are judged far more harshly by both genders. They are seen as trying to use their feminine wiles to gain power. They are seen, in fact, as just as problematic as women who vie for leadership positions. So that's why I put this slide, damned if she does, damned if she doesn't, right? If you try to gain power by self-sexualizing, you are judged harshly. If you try to gain power by playing the boys' game, you are also judged harshly. I want to take a little time. You're going to wonder why I'm calling this a consequence for the workplace. We find that higher self-objectification is associated with a lot of problems in terms of our attitudes toward our own reproductive body. As a menopausal woman, I want to do more work on this with menopause as well. We find that higher self-objectification predicts more shame and self-disgust toward menstruation, a greater likelihood for young women to opt for menstrual suppression, less likelihood to opt to breastfeed and instead choosing the bottle. Higher self-objectifiers have a greater likelihood of elective C-section delivery. This is surgery. It carries potential consequences. And higher self-objectification predicts a greater likelihood of plastic surgery for the genital area, such as labiaplasty. I want to talk about why I think this has impacts for the workplace, and maybe we'll wait on that for a second. Finally, self-objectification has a consequence that I call justifying the system. Research shows that members of disadvantaged groups not only pretend to accept their station in life, but actually do begin to see themselves through the dominant cultural lens. My colleagues and I are showing that objects don't object. Higher self-objectification is related to greater support for the gender status quo. The more I adopt this view of myself, the more I feel as though that's right. Men and women do occupy different stations in life. My job is to be pretty. His job is to do the work, right? And this support for the gender status quo is then negatively related to any interest that women might have in collective action or feminism or feminist identification. And this is what I come back to try to explain the now even higher percentage of white women who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than even did in 2016. Why? Because to adopt this perspective on the self is to believe that the gender status quo is right, and to think that a pussy-grabbing politician probably isn't a problem. Here I am with my dear roommate, Katie Kunz Wilkinson, at graduation in 1985. We did not have an Ivy Day because it poured rain. And class of 85 feels very resentful about not having an Ivy Day, I will tell you. When I was a senior, I took Art 100 and I discovered a book written by John Berger. And in this book, he argued that to be naked is to be yourself. It means you just took your clothes off because you needed to get in the shower, or it was a hot day and you were with your loved ones. To be nude, on the other hand, is to be seen by others and not recognized for yourself. Nakedness is simply a revealing of the body. Nudity is the body on display. And the nude, he said, is condemned to never being naked, because nudity, ironically, is a form of dress. I studied art history. I remember studying Botticelli's Venus and thinking about this distinction between nude and naked. And it's now coming around full circle, because I would argue that to sexually objectify is to turn someone into a nude. And here is an example of a recent Netflix movie release. This was a French film designed as a deep critique of the sexual objectification and sexualization of girls and girls' own self-sexualization. It was released in France. It was made by an African French director, and she won all kinds of awards. It's called Mignons in French. And you can see the difference between the poster that the French film had and the poster that Netflix revealed for the American audience. I mean, the contrast couldn't be more obvious, could it? Objectification theory is a feminist psychological scientific theory. We argue that sexual objectification and self-objectification serve to create, reinforce, and maintain patriarchy. And we hope that our work helps to identify the causes of these sometimes invisible processes and to uncover the costs that are carried by those of us who identify as female, and to provide practitioners and policymakers an evidence base to combat this kind of treatment in the lives of girls and women. Thank you so much.
So sorry, I had to get back to the right screen. So thank you very much, Tomi-Ann. And we have some great questions that have come up in the Q&A and great comments too.
Oh, great. Shall I stop sharing so that I can see that?
If you'd like to, yeah. And then we can actually see you.
Great.
We'll make you full view. So I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A, and I think I'll sort of roll back the tape to 1985, 84, and ask the question, did you know when you went to the audition that you wouldn't be considered for the part, or did you learn that at the audition? And what was your emotional reaction to that at the time?
Yeah, of course, I didn't think I would get the part. But the baldness of that, right? She looked at me and she shook her head. She said, you know, you're not going to get this part, right? And it just made me realize that Harvey had called her, right? It was so strange. I had brought a very beefcake friend of mine to the audition, and he waited in the waiting room because that's how scared I was. I didn't know what the audition was going to look like. So no, I can't say that I expected I would get the part, but I didn't know that it would be quite so patently obvious that the reason is because I didn't go along with something.
Right, right. Well, thank you. So Carrie asks, how do you reconcile objectification and revealing clothing with body positivity and body shaming / slut shaming? I have a hard time navigating this, particularly since the clothing industry is driven by men.
Oh, what a great question. And we could spend the whole Q&A on this question. Yes, body positivity. It's really interesting, isn't it? I think the things we have to unpack here are, first of all, for the most part, if you take a look at the images that are designed to be a celebration of body positivity, you will see that heteronormative sexual attractiveness is never critiqued. So what we see is something like, even you, very heavy woman, can look great in a bikini. Even you, not fully abled woman, can look great in a bikini. In other words, body positivity, the positivity is still about a kind of sexual, a 24/7 sexual attractiveness and availability to what I call the male gaze, G-A-Z-E. And that has never been critiqued, right? What about the positivity that can come from a recognition of the things my body can do that have nothing to do with its sexuality, right? The things my body can accomplish, the ways my body gets me from point A to point B, etc. So I think also we have to critique the sort of short and long-term goals of self-sexualizing. And what I try to say to my students is that there's a difference between status and power. Your sexy selfie may gain you a lot of likes. You may get a lot of followers, right? That is a kind of status. But can that be traded in for something meaningful for your life? Can you earn something from that? Can you become? Can you get elected? Can you make new laws? Can you earn a living? You know, some people are earning a living self-sexualizing, but not a lot, right? So I think the question we also have to ask is this difference between feeling personally validated and getting actual power and influence in the world.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. So we have a few questions now. I'm looking for sort of common threads. Here's an interesting one. My 24-year-old daughter has adopted the pronoun they in large measure to fend off their experiences of self-objectification resulting from the constant barrage of others' objectification of them. Do you know of any research assessing the impact of adopting a gender-neutral pronoun on these objectification dynamics?
Oh, what an amazing question.
Smithies are asking the questions.
I want your daughter to do research on this. We are only beginning to get studies coming out on trans and objectification theory. So the intersections between trans and objectification. But I really love your idea because we know the power of words, right? When we name things, it changes our experience, right? There are languages that don't have a different color for a different word for green and blue, right? And in those languages, individuals don't see green and blue as different colors. So what would happen if we really start to unpack gendered pronouns to the ways we see bodies? I think a lot's going to change. I really do. I really do. We know that in languages that have gender built into the language, so the Romance languages, Italian and Spanish and so on, in those languages we do see more traditional gender role ideologies. So we know that language can play a role. So I'm excited to see what happens, and I hope more research comes out on this question, but I love it.
Yeah, it's great. And I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg with it.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So armed with the knowledge of objectification in its various forms, how do we push back against it and empower women, girls, femmes?
You know, I think one thing that the neoliberal individualist economy that we've been living in, one thing it has wrought is that it's falsely convinced us that our empowerment is in our own individual hands. And so we shouldn't, you know, it's no surprise that young girls in the era of the Kardashians are going to find that empowerment will be through self-sexualizing, whatever. And the problem with this neoliberal approach is that for you to be empowered, you're going to have to walk on top of others who can't, right? In that kind of a, it's a zero-sum game when we're individually competing with one another to not hate me because I'm beautiful. Then we lose track of the fact that there's a sisterhood, right? Trump voting white women disidentify with their gender. They don't want to be seen as sisters with all women who are still fighting for equal pay, who are still fighting for reproductive rights, et cetera, right? And so I think one of our first steps is to shed this myth that our own individual success is not always already intimately tied to the success of our sisters, right? We've just, it's not about just leaning in me. I want to lean in on behalf of my friends. We need to lean in for one another. And so to me, you know, the selling of the bill of goods that your self-sexualizing is the best thing you can do for your own empowerment is only possible in this sort of neoliberal framing. And we need to return to me, a feeling of sisterhood and of all boats rise So,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that's why Smith is just so great, right? Like, being Smithies gives us this automatic, incredible sisterhood.
Mhm.
And, every alumni quarterly I get, I'm just sort of like brimming with this sort of secondhand glory and pride
Mhm.
of all of the amazing contributions that my sisters are making. So
Mhm.
anyway, that
Yeah.
was maybe a little bit of a soapbox.
That's okay. In fact, one of the questions was asking about self-objectification as a reason for the increase in women voting for Trump 2020. She says, I wouldn't want to blame the victim, but it seems to let these women off the hook a bit.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought, right? As a psychologist, I am often walking a very fine line between arguing that, self-objectification and self-sexualization, sounding like I'm blaming the victim. I'm not. I'm precisely not. What we need to do is address this as a structural issue, right? So for a lot of white women, the only thing they have, right, is adopting this perspective in order to curry the favor of powerful white men that they can then associate with.
Mm.
So yeah, I think right now I um I don't really want to make nice with those women, but I do want to understand
Mhm.
what's bringing them to this perspective. So it's a really good question, and it's a really hard one, and I battle with it a lot.
Yeah. Seems very complex. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and think about, I mean, oh my God, think about how classist this all is.
Mm.
To be able to afford all of the things it takes to keep your hair that dyed and the surgeries going and the this and that, women of color are just left in the dust, right? Women who don't meet the body size and shape standard, there's just no amount of money for some women that's going to bring them the outcome that they're seeking. But furthermore, the outcome is so racialized that it's like, and classist, that we forget that, a very, very few women in the United States are capable of keeping this up just financially.
Right. Right. Hmm. So let's see, we have a lot of really interesting questions and only about 10 minutes left. So there's one that I want to save for last because I think it's just really terrific. But let's go to, we did that one. How has attending Smith informed your work, and how does a single sex environment for women alter instances of self-objectification? We've touched on it, but specifically related to Smith.
I As I got to know a lot of the other victims and survivors, some call themselves victims, others survivors of Harvey Weinstein specifically. So I'm in a very dubious club. I'm in a club of, we call ourselves the Harvied. Um, and I I realized that I knew full well that summer that I was going back home. I was going back home to Smith, and that all kinds of possibilities were still, or maybe now newly available to me. Whereas so many of the women that I've spoken to in this whole Me Too movement in the past few years, they just had no options at all. None, right?
Mm.
Of course, they went along with whatever it was to get the part or
Mm.
to get safely out of the room.
Mm.
And so I think just being at Smith made me realize, like, I get to go home. I get to go do something not this at all. And even though I will confess, I felt ashamed. I felt like, God, I'm not cut out for this. I wish I was sort of cooler about my sexual attitudes.
Mm.
Then I would go along with this. But it didn't take me long to realize that it was some feminist smithy on my shoulder that got me out of the room. And that it was nothing to be ashamed of. So, and then, I had a fantastic senior year, and Smith Smith was home.
I imagine that experience probably impacted the choices you made in your senior year too.
Oh,
Classes and-
absolutely, absolutely. As I say, I took Art 100 and I just could not stop thinking about the treatment of the nude in Western art. And it just stuck with me. But I majored in psychology, and I spent time in grad school being like, well, I can't really combine art history and psychology. It wasn't until much later that I brought those two things together.
Mhm. Good. There's a great question here, and I know that we won't get to all the questions, and I apologize, but we'll work our way through as many as we can. Can you please talk about artists like Liz Phair, Lizzo, and others who use sexually explicit lyrics and or clothing and clearly want to own their sexuality and the public's access to it?
Yeah. I feel like people like these people are remarkable to me. I love the way that they are uh, owning their sexuality in a very different way than, let's say, the Kardashians, right? So these are individuals who Lizzo refuses a sort of heteronormative commodification. She is boldly occupying a ton of space with her body, right? And I think Liz Phair, God, I remember listening to her lyrics, some of which are just like so raunchy, you can't even believe it. But sort of bucking the trend of the kinds of lyrics that are only about the gaze, only about self-objectification, and sort of flipping that script. So the two examples you raised to me are fantastic artists who are flipping that male gaze around, diversifying the gaze, sort of spitting in the face of the traditional heteronormative scripts around that gaze.
Mhm. Good. So how do women best engage men to align and support change?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I think one of the things that I always try to say to my own partner and to all the men who I love in my life is don't leave this to us, right? Step up. Say how much you find the behavior of, serial predators like Harvey Weinstein problematic. But also, what we need to do is we need to recognize that men are part of a system. If we just delete the true monsters like Harvey Weinstein, we haven't solved the problem at all, right? We're just like, oh, cancel Harvey Weinstein as though he were some kind of aberration or anomaly. That's not the only time in my life where I was treated like a piece of meat. Are you kidding me? That's just the most famous treatment. And so I think men need to step up as our allies and call out this kind of behavior and this kind of framework on masculinity and reject it and publicly reject it. And it's going to mean rejecting a lot of what American society says is good about masculinity. So I urge anyone who hasn't found Jackson Katz's work, K-A-T-Z. Jackson Katz is one of my favorite sociologists working to sort of upend our American heteronormative notions of masculinity and to really shine a light on how much sexual objectification of women is part and parcel of American masculinity and how to tear those things apart.
you have information on that that you can share, we will share it out to all the
Yeah,
participants.
yeah, he's
Follow.
wonderful.
Right. So we've got just a few minutes left, and like I said, I apologize that that we haven't gotten to every question. But
Okay, I see someone who said, this is my case against high heels. Emily
yes,
Williamson, shout out. Because guess what? I love to say sensible shoes are not, the shoes themselves are not sensible. They're called sensible because they make us more sensible. Why? Because we are not distracted by the pain of the high heels. so they're not self-objectifying in the sense, right? They're not occupying us with having to walk very carefully, having to manage the pain. So they make us sensible. So shout out to sensible shoes.
really good point. Are you seeing any in the Q&A or in the chat that you would like to address, Tomi-Ann?
Let's see. Gosh, what would regulation in the media look like? Oh boy. Well, one thing we need to do is we need to join so many European countries in stopping advertising to children under 12. I mean, we've just got to, it just doesn't happen in a lot of countries. Child developmental psychologists have perfectly well shown that small children cannot be fed a steady diet of advertising of anything because they don't understand that advertisers are trying to manipulate them. So I think starting there would be great. Carla Dilgard said, did deregulation of the media in the 80s make this worse? Amazing question. And I wonder, I often wonder that. I mean, certainly, did you see the movie? It starred Charlize Theron on Fox News. What was that movie called? About the sort of ladies of Fox News. Anyway.
If you know the name.
Yeah, I can't. Bombshell. Yes. I feel like that movie, thank you, Vicki and Catherine. I feel like that movie did not get the attention it ought to have. It was sort of sandwiched between a lot of other great movies, but Bombshell was a stunner. I mean, it was an important film in my view.
Great. And I also see the question from Eileen, are we making progress? It seems like we've been talking about women as objects since the 1960s. But certainly looking at your slide deck, hopefully. But what's your take on that?
You know, I would almost want to argue we've backslid. I don't, it's not just that we haven't made progress. I think that, as I'm saying, this sort of neoliberal combined with the explosion in social media or whatever I don't think free to be you and me is on the table for parents anymore. I don't believe young women have heard of the Boston Women's Health Collective or Our Bodies, Ourselves. I think that sexuality has become so performative, so individualized, so much in the achievement domain as opposed to the affiliation domain that it's gotten worse, right? That it's gotten worse to me.
And probably a little more covert, not quite so boldly. I'm thinking of the ad from the 60s. That you're in a man's world.
Yes. Oh, yes. I think, I think what we do is we sort of change with the era what the idealized femininity is. And back then it was a domestic ideal, right? And now it's a 24/7 sexy availability ideal. Yeah.
Well, we have reached time. I'm sure we could probably keep talking for another hour and only scratch the surface. So thank you so very much for this amazing presentation and Q&A. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking time out of your day to join us. We're delighted to connect with you all virtually in these unprecedented times and appreciate your connection and your commitment to Smith. When we conclude the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to provide us with some feedback and a brief survey. We're working on offerings for the spring semester, and we certainly welcome your input. So thank you again for being with us today, and we wish you a very peaceful and restful Thanksgiving.
I'm wearing my broken glass ceiling necklace that a student gave me many years ago, and I haven't taken it off since Kamala Harris got elected vice president-elect.
Wonderful. What a great way to close. So thank you so much, and thank you all too. Have a great day and a great Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.